Newsfeed continues in a moment with a look at what's been leading in the news. First, though, award-winning filmmaker, author and activist Tsitsi Dangarembga made headlines last year when she was arrested in Harare after being part of a two-woman protest. Now, she and her friend Julie Barnes stood next to a highway silently holding a placard protesting against state corruption and the imprisonment of journalist Hopo Chinono. Now, the two were arrested and charged with incitement to participate in public violence and breaching anti-coronavirus regulations. Now, even though they wore masks and maintained a sizable distance from each other. Dangarembga joins us now to talk about her work as an artist and as well as a citizen in Zimbabwe and an activist. Tsitsi, good evening and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Hello. I'm afraid you're a bit low and I can't really hear you very well.
I'm going to try and speak a little bit louder, and of course I'll ask our technical team to assist us. Is that a little bit better for you?
That's much better, thank you.
All right. Tsitsi, first and foremost, I find it quite an interesting story that 3 days after you are longlisted for the Booker Prize, which is a very prestigious literary prize indeed, you are then arrested for your activism. Just what happened? Tell us the story of when you received the news that you're being longlisted and to the arrest.
Well, I did receive the news that I had been longlisted on the 28th of July last year, and it was really out of the blue because I didn't even know that my novel, This Mournable Body, had been entered for the Booker Prize there. And I was really very engaged with what was happening on the ground in Zimbabwe in terms of resistance to the increasing oppression that was going on in the country at the time. And so it was really lovely to have something positive to think about. So then I went out demonstrating on the 31st of July, and that was when I was arrested.
Now, what gave rise to the decision, right, to want to go out and actually put your body on the line? Because, of course, you had been very vocal on social media. There were conversations that were going on, and it was clear that the government was saying, well, the protest is illegal. In fact, they were even threatening that it is insurrection. It would be that severe. What made you still want to go out, even with all that that was out there already?
You know, really there comes a time when a person has to make a decision. And we had been in lockdown for some weeks by then. Many things that had been promised didn't happen, like help and aid for vulnerable communities and populations. And yet we were hearing about large amounts of money being embezzled, COVID relief funds and equipment being stolen, and the government taking a very cavalier attitude to any questioning about what was happening with what essentially was the property of the citizens. If funds come in to fight COVID, then those funds are with government in trust for the citizen. And we expect the government to behave in a trustworthy manner with those monies. And yet journalists who had exposed the frauds that was going on around the COVID-19 relief funds and materials were hounded down by the government. They were put into jail. Their relatives even were hounded by the government. And it really was an untenable solution. So the question for me was, do I allow myself to be intimidated as a citizen, or do I take a stand? And in fact, at the time, some people who are in the opposition had been calling for a mass demonstration, and it really looked as though there was going to be a mass demonstration. But Zimbabweans are still very jittery. The liberation struggle, where terrible atrocities were committed upon the bodies of black Zimbabwean people by both the Rhodesian security forces and the liberation forces, is still within living memory. And since then, we have ongoing spates of violence, especially around elections or when power is contested. And then we had come out of the coup, which had looked like an improvement was taking place, But by 2018, we realized that we were back in the old situation with citizens being shot on the street. And so it really seemed to me that people would take up this call to go out on the street to demonstrate all of these things, the corruption plus all the other areas of misgovernance and abuse and oppression and even killing of citizens.
Yeah.
And so I was determined to go out. Yes, the government did tell us not to go out onto the street, but the Constitution does provide for peaceful demonstration. And so I thought I would go anyway.
Yeah. Did you give thought to what conviction might mean, a jail sentence, and how you would navigate that in your work that you're doing as a filmmaker, as an author, as an activist? I mean, did you even worry about that at all? Did it concern you, that the prospect of being convicted in a jail sentence?
No, I didn't worry about that at all. I didn't even give the thought of arrest much time, because I thought, I'm just one woman. I have nothing except myself and some of the writing that I've done. My activism is always peaceful. Non-violent struggle is really my belief. I feel that there has been so much violence on this continent and in Zimbabwe also, that to engage in any form of violent struggle is simply to perpetuate violence, and you cannot obtain peace by perpetuating violence. I know that there are some schools of thought that say violence can bring you to peace, but we haven't actually seen that happen on our continent, and I don't know where else we have seen it happen. Normally, violence just begets more violence. So really, non-violent struggle is central to the ways that I engage with the government as a citizen of Zimbabwe. And I had made that abundantly clear.
Right,
and so I didn't expect that I would be arrested just for carrying 2 pieces of paper. I didn't think so.
Yeah. We'll come back to talk about that, as well as, of course, that you were being celebrated in one end. Your own country was putting you behind the back of a van. Were they even aware at that point in time that you are being celebrated the world over? But let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more to that and then get into the trilogy itself of the novels that have gotten you this worldwide accolade. We are with award-winning filmmaker, author, and activist Tsitsi Dangarembga. We continue next year on the Newsfeed Late Night in this conversation. Stay with us. Welcome back on the Newsfeed Late Night, and our continued look at what's leading in the news right now, though. Still in conversation with award-winning filmmaker, author, and activist Tsitsi Dangarembga. She is, of course, with us to talk about her work and, of course, this great accolade that she has received, one of the most prestigious literary prizes in the world, to have given her a nod for her work that she has been doing since 1988. Now, Tsitsi, I was talking before the break about the, I suppose, contrast of being celebrated 3 days ago by this long listing, and then the people in Zimbabwe putting you behind the back of a police van. Were they aware at all of what was happening, that you are this celebrated novelist at that time, that there is this huge accolade that could possibly be coming to the country?
Thabo, some Zimbabweans were aware that I had been longlisted for the Booker Prize with my novel, This Mournable Body, but those were the people who were on social media, and especially the social media where I am active myself, which is mainly Twitter, also a bit of Facebook and some WhatsApp groups. But because there was a blackout on that achievement by the Zimbabwean government, the ordinary Zimbabwean was not aware of it, because it simply wasn't news in Zimbabwe. And so it was unfortunate that people didn't realize that a Zimbabwean had in fact received such an honor, but that is the situation. As for the government, I doubt whether many were aware. Possibly some would have been aware because it's their job to monitor that kind of news, but it would have been something that really was not discussed much, because the policy of simply not providing any media space to people who are not ZANU-PF or people who are seen as being opposed to ZANU-PF and aligned with the opposition would have prevailed.
What does that say about where the government is right now in terms of what they are wanting to hide, but also what does it say about the ZANU government and its desire to rule for the people?
Thabo, I think that says that the Zimbabwean government is in a very dark space. I think that dark space is a space that really began before independence. As people in South Africa know, in this country also, the experience of colonization and here apartheid is a really negative experience, and it really is not an experience in which positive things can grow. Then one goes into a brutal war of liberation where terrible things happen, because this is also a guerrilla war. It's not even conventional warfare where there are more rules. Even conventional warfare can be horrific, but guerrilla warfare where the rules are so vague is even worse. And so many dark things can happen there. And Zimbabwe did not have any kind of justice, restorative justice mechanism. I know that people in South Africa say that the TRC was really flawed, but it was an acknowledgement that something had happened. We did not even have that in Zimbabwe. We were simply told that the war was over. It was now time to beat swords into plowshares. Those people who were enemies were now going to be allies and work together for the good of the nation. And that was that. The discourse that was promoted after that was about the glory of the war, all the wonderful things that the guerrillas had done and had delivered the country to the people. And so there was absolutely no engagement with the negative side, which war always has. And so we can see manifestations of that negativity now, and even up until now, within ZANU-PF itself, there does not seem to be any engagement with that is done in the public domain.
Let's talk about your body of work now that is being celebrated. I mean, it starts with a nervous condition. It's now the mournable body. It's the third installment in these books, and we are seeing Thabo Mdluli once again coming to the fore. Who is Thabo Mdluli? That's what I wanted to ask.
Thabo Mdluli is a young rural girl when we first meet her in nervous conditions. She wants to go to school, but her brother has been sent to school because the family is very poor. And so she fights to go back to school by growing mealies, which she then sells green. And she manages to get back to school. And then her wealthy uncle takes her to his mission to educate her. And so that is the story of nervous conditions. And then the other two books, the Book of Not and This Mournable Body, just track Thabo Mdluli's growth into womanhood through the time of the liberation struggle and in independent Zimbabwe.
Now, in The Mournable Body, we find you having gone through that whole process, the schooling system, hoping that it will amount to something. In fact, you will have a better life. But it turns out she doesn't have a better life. In fact, you're saying when she opened the book, she's still living in a hostel where she's about to be kicked out.
Yes, absolutely. When I began the trilogy with nervous conditions, I had no idea that Thabo Mdluli's life would turn out like that. But since I was writing in the present, to write anything else would really have been a fairy tale, because nobody would believe that one could just come out of university, work a couple of years, and enter into a job that can actually sustain a comfortable living. That simply doesn't happen anymore in Zimbabwe. And so these were some of the realities that I was talking about in that book. I didn't set out to write a trilogy that reflected the decline of the country, but people's livelihoods and people's senses of self and people's sense of morality has also declined with the decline in the country. And so it was inevitable that this would be reflected in the literature that I wrote about this period.
Yeah. I mean, there are a number of things that suppose you are doing through the book, one of which is to present Thabo Mdluli to herself and to see the ugly part of what is herself, and maybe begin to accept even those ugly parts and other parts that are great about her, presenting her blackness to herself and being able to accept that. But on the other end, you're also dealing with some of the anger issues that emanate from the fact that you think you're doing the right thing, but actually it doesn't turn out that way in society. But what are you trying to get society to do? I mean, you're trying to shake them into something.
Thabo, what I tried to get society to do with this mournable body is to introspect, to look back and reflect. You know, introspection and reflection of that nature is not really very widely valued in my culture in Zimbabwe. In fact, if somebody is showing signs of stress or depression, one of the first things that people say is, oh, don't think too much. So thinking too much has a negative connotation. However, when we live in the kind of complex society that we live in now, with all the baggage that we have carried with us over a century in Zimbabwe, and we fail to reflect on this, it is very unlikely that we are going to be able to go forward in a positive manner that enables us to deal with the past well and so build a better future. And this was one of the messages that I was trying to get across. Just as when things don't go well in one's own life, one needs to reflect. So that can be done at a national level also. And I wanted to distinguish reflection from praying. Of course, there's an element of reflection in praying because you want to ask for things, you want to ask for guidance. But the kind of reflection that I was thinking about was the kind where you go into yourself to meet yourself.
And who is the voice of reason in Thabo Mdluli's life? And symbolically, what does that character represent?
Yes, voice of reason. She has perhaps two. She has her cousin Yasha, and then she also has her aunt Lucia. So these two people are people who have a perspective on life and understand a bit more than Thabo Mdluli does. And so they try to bring her onto the right track.
Yeah. And I mean, when you look at that symbolically in society, the cousin and the aunt, who are those? I mean, if we're looking at a society that right now is in that dark place and that dark space and that needs to be awakened and given that rude awakening?
That's a really excellent question, Thabo. Who are these people? In the context of Thabo Mdluli, it's her family. It's the people around her. It's not the people outside. It's not that we're saying, go and look elsewhere. You have to look to yourself. And so in the context of Zimbabwe, this would be Zimbabweans looking to themselves. Of course, people can always give guidance, but at the end of the day, a Zimbabwean problem has to be solved by Zimbabweans amongst themselves. There has to be agreement. We want to solve our problems in this way. So the question arises, do we want to solve our problems using force? Do we want to solve our problems using violence? Do we want to solve our problems using torture and oppression and by weaponizing the judiciary and by weaponizing a pandemic? Or do we want to solve our problems in an inclusive way where democracy has a chance to begin to grow?
What does the Booker Prize mean to you? I mean, when you eventually got the news that you have won, I mean, what did it mean?
It would have been wonderful, of course, to win the Booker Prize. Every writer, well, or at least most writers, I imagine, would love to win the Booker Prize. For myself, it would have meant a fattening of my checkbook, which would have been welcome. But also, I really would have liked to have won it to give Zimbabweans something to celebrate. Zimbabwean people are so depressed right now. So many people can really see nothing positive on the horizon. That would have been wonderful. But on the other hand, the recognition has been very good for me, and it's opened up some channels where I can do several things. Right at the moment, I am in Stellenbosch. I have a fellowship at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study, and so that's wonderful. And so I hope that I will still find ways to deliver hope and positive things on the horizon for the people who engage with my work.
In fact, what you say in one interview is that if you want your suffering to end, you have to act. What compels your activism at this point today?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
What compels your activism today?
A sense of justice compels my activism. A sense of outrage at people who say they are doing one thing, liberating us, but are putting us under another terribly violent yoke that in some ways is worse than colonial oppression, because with colonial oppression, or should I say European colonial oppression, one had the hope that once one freed oneself as a black nation, then life would be better. And now we see that even with that freedom that comes with being a black nation, the political freedom, this did not translate into better lives for very long at all. Already by the turn of the millennium, 20 years ago, the signs of things falling apart and the center not holding were already apparent. And so a sense of justice, a desire for a common good, really, is very strong in me, because I realize that if the person next door to me does not have a sustainable life, my own sustainable life will not be sustainable. It will always be at risk. And so the idea of the common good is really self-serving in the end. And this is something that I think culture in Zimbabwe needs to build up an understanding of.
Tsitsi, I appreciate your time, and thank you very much for joining us tonight here on the Newsfeed Late Night. And of course, that is award-winning filmmaker, author and activist, celebrated the world over, Tsitsi Dangarembga, there telling us of course, her activism, but also how she views things currently in Zimbabwe and how she expresses that through her work and her writing.